All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Division of Environmental Health at the University of Cape Town's Pesticide Discussion Forum. Thank you so much to those that have been introducing themselves in the chat. If you've only just come in, you can go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. My name is Maxine Brassel, and I'm a project manager in the Division of Environmental Health at UCT. And I'd like to introduce you to Tatum Lowe today as well. She will be the technical and administrative support for this discussion, and she will be doing all the background work. So thank you, Tatum, for that. As mentioned, please introduce yourself in the chat for us at the moment. If you can't find the chat, it is a little speech bubble icon at the bottom of your screen. You can simply click on the chat and introduce yourselves, giving us your name, the country you're from, and the organization that you represent. Today, I'd like to welcome you to our next pesticide discussion forum. The purpose of the UCT Pesticide Discussion Forum is to bring representatives from different regions, sectors, and stakeholder groups together to foster a mutually supporting consortium of stakeholders to discuss various issues related to pesticides. Particularly to build the capacity of regulators, researchers, and NGOs in low and middle income countries, and to discuss emerging issues. We hope to achieve this by learning from each other, sharing information and data, identifying gaps, and problem solve collectively to reduce and prevent pesticide poisonings and environmental contamination, with a view to a toxic-free future for the next generation. So I will just talk us through the process of our discussion. For those who have not joined us before, this is not a webinar, but rather a chat discussion. We will be discussing things in the chat room quite frequently, and there will be minimal presentations. So we really encourage you to be engaging in the chat, to answer our questions, to add your contributions so that we can also hear what you have to say today. This is a non-partisan discussion, which means that we respect all viewpoints and we value all input, even if we may not agree with it ourselves. Please include your country and your organization when you respond in the chat, just so we know where you are coming from. And as mentioned, please engage with others' responses, engage with our presenter today. And yeah, we're just keen to hear your thoughts. So the flow of this discussion, we will have a brief introductory presentation from our presenter, which then will lead to a question being posed to the audience. We will then go and discuss this question in the chat. The question will be posted in the chat, and yeah, we will encourage you to answer the question and engage with us in that. There will be a 5-minute warning posted towards the end of the discussion time, asking you to send your final responses, and then we will wrap up that question and move on to another presentation, followed by more questions. During this process, we will be posting polls on Mentimeter. All the information to vote on those polls will be on the screen and posted in the chat. So please engage with the polls and post your responses to that as well. So today's discussion is entitled How to Restrict Access to Hazardous Pesticides While Protecting Agriculture, a Pesticide and Suicide Focus. It will be presented by Finbar Horgan from the Center for Pesticide Suicide Prevention. Finbar is a technical specialist with the Center for Pesticide Suicide Prevention, currently seconded to the Pest and Pesticide Management team at the Food and Agricultural Organization. He is an agroecologist with experience in plant protection, mainly against insect-related yield or productivity losses from Europe, North America, Latin America, Asia, and Australia. His work focused on optimizing agro-ecosystem services to ensure that plant production systems represent a safe environment for humans and wildlife. Finbar has worked at the International Potato Centre, the International Rice Research Centre, and the Irish Agri-Research and Advisory Authority. He joined the Centre for Pesticide Suicide Prevention in 2021 with a focus on promoting alternatives to the use of pesticides in general and highly pesticide pesticides in particular among farmers in countries with high incidences of pesticide-related suicides. He also supports the preparation and implementation of the Global Plan on HHPs at the FAO. He has developed and led the Healthy Farms, Healthy Farmers campaign in the Philippines to reduce farmer dependency on pesticides by promoting ecologically engineered rice ecosystems. He is interested in One Health approaches to farm management and wildlife-friendly agro-ecosystems. So I would like to now welcome Finbar. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to hand over to you for the beginning of our presentation.
Thank you very much, Maxine, and thank you all for attending this session. So what I want to do today is clarify some concepts from the point of view of a pesticide or an IPM person or a plant health expert, let's say, because there's a lot of terms that go around that overlap and that need to be separated out and that need to be better defined for clarity in the debate around restricting highly hazardous pesticides. So next slide, please. Okay, so I think most people here are aware of what highly hazardous pesticides are, but just for those who may need to be reminded, these are a small group, a relatively small group of pesticides from the entire gamut of pesticides that are available. And this small group is highly associated with a number of serious health consequences for human beings, cause most of the damage that occurs from pesticides to the environment. And they've been listed in a number of conventions and a number of lists as pesticides to watch out for because of their dangers to humans and the environment. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to present a kind of an overview of what is out there in terms of pest management and what farmers are doing in the field. And I'm going to put this in the frame of integrated pest management. Now, integrated pest management is a framework that began to be developed in the 1970s in response to Rachel Carson's expose of the hazards of pesticides. At that time, practically all pesticides were highly hazardous. Integrated pest management began to develop in the United States, propagated throughout the rest of the world. And though it's sort of a framework and it's a basis for much of the dialogue and the research and you know the actions that go on in pest management, it's actually very seldom practiced in reality. And I think this is important to know that you know when we talk about IPM, it's a very good standard, but it's rarely practiced. Next slide, please. So IPM has a number of different facets. One of the things that IPM says is, look, we have to exhaust all possible alternatives to using pesticides before we head into curative practices. It says that we should monitor our crops for damage, and we should be able to balance the costs of a curative practice with the potential damage caused by a pest or a weed or a disease. So I just want to give you here a kind of an outlook of, or an overview of what plant protection actually means. And I want to divide it first into two sides, two parts. One is preventative actions and the other are curative actions. And what I want to do there is position HHBs. Where are HHBs in the gamut of plant protection that's available to us? So when we look at the preventative actions, these are a whole number of things that farmers can do. They can be at a landscape level or they can be at a field level. And these are basically things that we do to prevent pests and weeds from getting into densities where they cause damage to crops and reduce yields and reduce profits. These include all of the work, most of the work on agroecology. So, you know, providing environments that are suitable for natural enemies, for example, preventative actions like delayed planting. They include things like plant protection products, some plant protection products that are supplied to agrochemical companies, for example, glues that stop insects climbing up trees, or plastic barriers or nets, pheromones, for example. And all of these things are relatively safe. Then we have the curative actions, and the curative actions are things that farmers do once pests and diseases are at a density where they're likely to cause problems. And these can include simple things like picking insects off plants. They can include then a whole range of plant protection products, some of which are relatively harmless, for example, biopesticides. And then we have the chemical pesticides. And in reality, I mean, this graph is not the proportional in terms of the shapes, the sizes of each of these shapes, the relative sizes, let's say. But chemical pesticides are the main curative action, and perhaps for some farmers, the only plant protection action that farmers are undertaking. Now, within chemical pesticides, we have the highly hazardous pesticides. Next slide, please. Now, farmers will often continue to use highly hazardous pesticides, particularly in developing countries or lower and middle income countries, and there are reasons for that. So in this diagram here, I have a kind of a simple comparison of highly hazardous pesticides against other chemical pesticides like pyrethroids, neonicotinoids, etc., and then biopesticides. And biopesticides is a very wide-ranging category of pesticides that includes some biocontrol agents as well, for example. And if you look at the top three bars here, so the length of the bar indicates sort of a favorable condition for farmers, you see that highly hazardous pesticides are fast acting, and farmers like this. They like to apply a chemical and see everything dead on the ground. That's the way they think, you know. They like that they're stable because they're so toxic. They're very stable. They can be used in different environments, different weather conditions, and they're still functioning quite well. They're broad spectrum. Of course, this is a disaster for an ecologist, but for a farmer, when he sees that it's killing, you know, a bug and it's killing a caterpillar and it's killing, you know, all these different pests at the same time, they're happy with that. On top of that, at the moment, many highly hazardous pesticides in some countries are very widely available. They're generic at this stage because most of them are very old. They're a relatively good price for farmers, and farmers tell us they're easy to use. So they have a position there relative to other pesticides that farmers actually like. Next slide, please. The problems then, of course, are the environmental health consequences, which far outweigh any of the other products, chemical products or biopesticides that are available. So in terms of human health, the top three bars here, and in this case, we're looking at problems, so the wider the column, the more problematic the category of pesticide. And we see that highly hazardous pesticides are the widest for a whole range of things: cancers, neurological disorders, and other health impacts, you know. We have homicides and suicides almost entirely due to highly hazardous pesticides. It's very hard to kill yourself with biopesticides, and very few of other types of pesticides, pyrethroids and such, are implicated in homicide or suicide. They're persistent in the environment, so they end up in residues in food, and then they go back to people through the food cycle, and where they cause these problems. So the first three are really worrying for us, but then they also, because of their persistence and their toxicity, they cause a number of different problems in the environment. They kill pollinators, they upset regulation of pests by killing natural enemies, and then they're toxic to a whole number of other organisms, of wildlife, amphibians, birds, fish, mammals. They're also highly phytotoxic. They tend to be less easy in terms of pests and diseases developing resistance to them. But because they're so widely used, most of these highly hazardous pesticides have very large numbers of species of weeds or pests that are already resistant to them. Next slide, please. So this graph, what I want to do here, and again, the size of the circles here are not based on any concrete data at the moment, although we are working and trying to find out the relative importance of different curative actions in agriculture and in different parts of the world. But what we do see is that if you look at what farmers are doing in terms of curative actions, in Europe, they would be using a lot of chemicals. So there's a lot of chemical use, some other things, some biopesticides, very little curative action in terms of manual picking or burning of weeds and things like that. But when you look at HHPs, because of good legislation, the HHPs, the component of HHPs in the chemical pesticides is very, very small in typical countries in Europe. Whereas in a typical developing country, such as many of the countries in Africa or in Asia, what you would see is many farmers are still resorting to curative actions like hand picking and burning and using nets. Chemical pesticides are less prevalent in Africa than they would be in Europe, perhaps. But among those chemical pesticides, highly hazardous pesticides make up a much greater proportion. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, the last thing I just want to mention here briefly is that when you look across the whole gamut of different crops, some crops like highly tailoring crops, fast growing crops, crops with high tolerance and a low value to the product, like many grains, these are areas where pesticide use in general can be very, very substantially reduced. Other crops, seasonal crops, slow growing crops, high value products is a much more difficult process. They can, of course, be reduced in many, many ways. But many of the highly hazardous pesticides would be used predominantly in the second category here. And these are often products that we buy in the market and we eat raw, for example, fruits and vegetables. Next slide, please. So this is the background now to question one that we'll be looking at and discussing. And what I want to do here is draw attention to what I see in a number of documents. I see it coming up again and again in discussions we have with people and in documents that are being presented on pesticide use. And that is this idea that pesticide use increases proportional to pest-associated risks, meaning that farmers are using pesticides when the risks are there. And this really comes from the whole idea of IPM, that it's a kind of a model that says farmers are following IPM practices, when in reality, as I said to you before, they are not. And so we have to look at this as well in terms of context. You know, are we talking about traditional agriculture? We're talking about invasive species or climate-driven changes in plant-insect interactions. And I'll show you what I mean in the next slide, please. So this is data from the FAO on pesticide imports into Europe. So a number of different European countries from the 1960s, but the data really starts around the 1980s and going up into mid 2015, 2010, 2015. And what you see there is the trajectory of imports is increasing in all these countries. Now, most of these would be, of course, non-hazardous pesticides. But what I do want to indicate here is if you look at the graphs, what you do see is you see that there's an increase initially, and then there's a decline from the 90s to around 2000. And then after 2000, all these countries, many of these countries showing a very, very large increase in imports after 2000. So the start of the millennium. And you see it in France, Germany there, you see it in the UK, you see it in the Netherlands, you see it in Italy, all those countries. Next slide, please. Now, this is the same data for Southeast Asia, and this only goes up to 2010. But what you see here as well is that you see the same thing, a trajectory of increasing pesticide imports. But you also see in a number of countries there after 2000, a large increase. You see it in Japan, you see it in the Philippines, you see it in Indonesia very prominently. Up to 2000 is kind of flat, and then after 2000 an increase. Look at Singapore, and I'll talk about Singapore again a little bit later. So huge number, one of the largest there. You see it in Bangladesh. Next slide, please. And again, look at this trend. Again, we see it after 2000 in Africa. We have data there from Ghana. We have data from Cote d'Ivoire, Cameroon. We can see it in Rwanda there at the top right. All these countries increasing their imports of pesticides very rapidly after 2000. Next slide, please. So, of course, the question is that what could possibly be the reason in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, that farmers would be requiring more pesticides all of a sudden after the millennium? And the reality is there was no reason. There is no reason. There was no major increase in pest incidence. There was no massive change in climate between 1999 and 2000. The issue is about availability of pesticide, the production of pesticides. So at the start of 2000, so the start of this millennium, China had a 5-year plan, for example, where it said we're going to focus on chemical production. And here's some statistics from China. In 1990, China had 15 chemical factories. By 2010, China had 3,000 chemical parks or chemical plants. And these are industrial complexes with several factories all producing chemicals. And this is the same kind of thing happening in countries like Indonesia and India, largely with active ingredient coming from China. Next slide, please. So pesticide is produced and then it's sent to a central location. This is a photograph of ships going into Singapore Harbor. As I showed you in the data previously, Singapore is not an agricultural country. It doesn't have any agriculture, and yet it was the major importer of pesticide. And that's because it's a hub for pesticide to go to other countries in Asia. Next slide, please. So on the ground, what does this look like? Well, there's a lot of product now in all these countries, and you've got to get it out. You got to market it. You got to sell it. This is just a whole number of posters that I took photographs of in one day in Indonesia, and traveling around a rice producing area in Indonesia in one day, I photographed posters for 50 different insecticide products. So a lot of advertising, a lot of pressure for farmers to buy the product. Next slide, please. And then we get consequences at an ecological level that we can see. And this is a brown planthopper resurgence. So this is chemical induced resurgence of pest damage. So this is, and this is very well documented, been very well studied. Insecticides killing all the natural enemies and resulting in outbreaks of a very minor pest, something that's normally a minor pest, now becoming a huge pest and destroying hundreds of thousands of hectares of rice here in Indonesia and in other countries as well. Next slide, please. So we interviewed farmers, and the red area here is about 100,000 hectares. This was the area where planthoppers were devastating rice. And I'll just ask Tatum there to focus in on the first graph at the top there. And what we did, we asked farmers, we interviewed about 300 farmers, and we asked them how many times were they making applications to their rice crop. Now, remember, the rice crop is only 3 to 4 months long. And you can see here that farmers were spraying between 2009 and 2011, when you start to get these huge outbreaks, between 15 and 20 times to their fields. So that's every couple of days, they're making an application to their field. And then what happened, you see there yield losses because of planthopper basically going up to 75% around 2011. So here you have a case where the pesticide is being used, and then all of a sudden you get an outbreak. This outbreak is caused by the pesticide. There was no need to use the pesticide in the first place. Now, this is very serious for normal pesticides, but when farmers are using highly hazardous pesticides, this is really a catastrophe. Next slide, please. And what we see is that macroeconomics, global economics, is affecting things at local levels. So this graph here looks at outbreaks of planthoppers, which are really an indicator of overuse of pesticide. And you can see that they increased after the Green Revolution. And then in 1986, there was a ban on pesticides in Indonesia. And after that ban, a whole number of pesticides were removed from the market in Indonesia. And you get this rapid drop in outbreaks, very low levels of outbreaks for a decade. At the same time, you had FAO's farmer field schools very heavy on the ground in Indonesia. But then after 2000, look at again these outbreaks starting again because of these massive imports of HHPs. Okay, so another thing that happens there is that price becomes expensive, rice is expensive, farmers want to protect their rice more closely, so they're willing to put in more pesticides. I would anticipate that this year, 2022, or sorry, in the next couple of years, let's say, we'll start to see a massive amount of outbreaks again in Indonesia because of the high price of rice. And so next slide is the question that you can discuss. So I'll pass you again to Maxine.
Great, thank you so much for that, Finbar. That was a great presentation. So as you can see on the screen, there's a question that we will be discussing in the chat. Tatum has posted it in the chat for us, and the question reads, pesticides are overused in agriculture and industry in low and middle income countries. Do you agree with this statement? If yes, what do you think has led to the overuse of pesticides in your country? And if no, how has your country ensured that pesticides are not overused? Please list your country in your response. So please add your contributions to the chat. If you are having technical issues, please join the, or just let us know in the chat and we can see how we can help you. As mentioned, please keep your microphones muted and your cameras off, and Finbar will be responding to your responses in the chat. So thank you so much. We look forward to engaging with you.
So maybe I'll just respond there to a comment by Tom Murray. I think Tom is from Woolworths. It's great to have someone from Woolworths engaged here. Tom says, yes, he feels that pesticides are overused, particularly in crops that are not exported. And this is actually a major issue in many developing countries. That and we've seen this in the Philippines, in Indonesia, and Vietnam. Crops that go to local markets are often drenched in pesticides, unfortunately. You'd have to be very careful to consume things from some markets in some countries because they're not tested for residues. One interesting thing that has come up in my own research, and I won't mention which country I've seen this in, but actually there's a number of countries involved that I've seen, at least 3, where farmers will produce a crop for the market that they bombard with pesticides, and then they have a crop for themselves that they consume at home where they don't use any pesticides, and they will not eat the food that they're selling to the market because they're afraid of the health consequences for themselves of these pesticides.
Right, as you can see, we have posted our first poll. So as mentioned, these polls will be done on Mentimeter. So you can see on the screen that in order to respond to the poll, you can either go to www.menti.com and use the code on the screen to submit your responses, or you can click on the link in the chat that Tatum has posted and you can answer the poll there. So please let us know what you think and what your contributions are to the poll.
Okay, well that's looking interesting. I mean, a lot of people concerned that there's an overuse of pesticides. There's two comments there that I want to just answer briefly. One is from Zira, who says yes, farmers are using a lot of chemicals and they're using HHPs because they're cheaper. One of the things I would say is that there's, again, remember that farmers are not making their decisions correctly often. So yes, they're applying pesticides and they're applying HHPs more in Africa than other countries, because that's what's available, and they're going straight to curative actions. But very often they don't need to. And so the cheapest thing for a farmer to do is not to apply pesticides. But often if you ask a farmer, what happens if you don't apply pesticides to your crop? They'll say, we get zero production, we lose everything. And this is a misconception. This is completely wrong most of the time. So there is a need to educate farmers about preventative methods, agroecology, and other mechanical or cultural methods to avoid the use of any curative method. And this is easier, as I mentioned already, this is easier to do on low value crops. So corn, wheat, and tree crops, for example, for wood or rice. The second question is about malaria, and it's an interesting question because there's talk there about using HHPs to prevent malaria. And what I would say is that one of my interests is in One Health, and one of the things that we've noticed when we looked at the consequences of applications of pesticides in rice fields, for example, where you have a rice grown in water, and we monitored the organisms in the rice fields. One very, very clear result that we saw was that the use of pesticides was killing a lot of the organisms in the water, and what was left were some of these very resilient organisms, including mosquitoes. So there's an association, and this is not, we're not the first to show that, but certainly in rice crops, for example, pesticides, instead of actually reducing malaria incidence, might actually be increasing malaria or dengue, or just nuisance blood-sucking mosquitoes around rice fields.
Finbar, we're going to move on to the next poll soon, so I don't know if you'd like to say anything more about this poll, or if we could move on.
No, I think that's interesting. So most people believe that pesticides are overused already, and in many ways it's just starting in many of the developing countries. So it's more likely to become more overused as time goes by. So it's something I think that needs to be flagged and looked out for at this stage.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, we've posted our second poll, so same procedure as the first one. You can either go to menti.com and use the code on the screen to respond, or you can respond using the link that has been posted in the chat.
Okay, so just again a number of comments that are very interesting from India, from Madagascar, from Zambia, where farmers are predominantly using pesticides because there's this pesticide model, that pesticide is a part of modern agriculture. And we've conducted interviews with thousands of farmers all over Asia and in South America as well. And this is one of the things farmers have bought into, this model that pesticides are part of modern agriculture. And the other thing that we find is many farmers will say modern varieties require pesticides. There is some truth to that, because breeders have been deficient in ensuring resistance or tolerance in modern crops, but it's generally not the case. And the other thing there, flagged again by a colleague from Zimbabwe, that in Zimbabwe pesticides have been increasing, pesticide use has been increasing, and this has been attributed to increasing pressure from pests. There may be incidences of increasing pressure from pests that are local, because of bad management. It could even be the result of other farmers using pesticides in other places and creating an imbalance in the environment that then affects a farmer, a neighboring farmer, and he gets worried about the issue. But the important thing is to remember that pesticide use in the vast majority of cases has nothing to do with pesticide pressure. It's really a marketing problem.
Okay, I see that Tatum has posted our 5-minute warning. So that means everyone, you have 5 minutes left to discuss this question. Finbar, if you'd like to give some concluding remarks on this question and on the poll, and then we can move on to the next question shortly.
Okay, so I just asked for this poll to see if people really understand the concepts that we've been talking about and to better gauge how we go in the discussion. And I see that most people understand most of the concepts. One thing that seems not to be or is understood perhaps a little less is what's a pesticide adjuvant. And this is, I think, also an important issue because there are chemicals out there that people will say, oh, look, these are benign, they're not dangerous to humans, they're not dangerous in the environment. Glyphosate would be, for example, one. But then many chemicals have other substances mixed with them. And some of these other substances can be highly toxic and can be dangerous in the environment. And this is one of the problems with glyphosate, for example. Dioxins is another one. People will have heard of Agent Orange that was used in Vietnam and caused horrendous problems in terms of birth defects among children. Agent Orange is basically a herbicide that still is used today. And the problem was related to dioxins in the chemical that were a contaminant from the industrial process used to create the chemical, and they're not in that chemical anymore. So apart from highly hazardous pesticides, there are also other chemicals with pesticides that can also be highly problematic. So I think in general, people are in agreement that there's an overuse of pesticides. And I'm hoping that people will start to think that, or at least question this paradigm that pesticide use is related to pressures from insects and weeds and diseases. Yes, and I see just another comment there just come in about nitrogen fertilizer being linked to the incidence of pesticides, the use of pesticides. This is also true. This is a very complex thing, actually, fertilizer and the role of fertilizer in increasing insect damage. One thing that I think we need to understand with most crops is that fertilizer makes a plant more attractive to insects. It's more nutritive. So insects are deficient in nitrogen, they're looking for nitrogen. That's one of the main things they want from their food. So they'll go to those plants with high nitrogen. But the other thing is we have to look at it in terms of the plant and the availability of nitrogen to the plant, of course, is to increase yield. But in many, many cases, it increases tolerance to the insect. So what that means is that a plant under high nitrogen might have insect damage and might have more insect damage than a plant without nitrogen. But because it has that nitrogen source, because it's well fed, because it's strong, it's robust, it can tolerate that damage more, and yield is not affected, or sometimes it can even be overcompensating for yield, meaning that the damage is causing an increase in yield, actually, rather than a decrease. I think probably time-wise we have to move to the next question. Is that correct?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah, so we can move on to our next question. So Finbar, over to you.
So the next question had to do with alternatives, and the idea here is that when we discuss phasing out or banning or reducing pesticides, HHPs particularly, there's always these sort of claims of worry or perhaps real worries that important pest management products will not be available anymore to growers. And what I would say is that if you look at the history of pesticides throughout time, things have appeared in farmers' fields and in stores, and we've seen problems with them, and they've been banned time and time again. And so if you go back to, say, before the Second World War, farmers back into the late 1800s were using inorganic products. Some of these were very dangerous, like arsenic, for example, and these were replaced, phased out, replaced. They were difficult to use as well. And then we got DDT and other related pesticides coming in and being massively used. And then with Rachel Carson's book and a lot of research that was going on at the time, looking at problems with bird shells diminishing and residues in breast milk and such. DDT was successively banned in a number of countries. And then the next thing is there's a whole lot of other organofluorides that farmers moved to and that the pesticide industry began to focus on. And many of these then became banned. Some of them are still around, but most were banned. And then we moved to the organophosphates, and people are starting to see organophosphates now a problem, and many of these are being banned. And now you're replacing it with another group of chemicals, pyrethroids and neonicotinoids. And these are much safer, obviously, for humans and for many mammals, because they're basically analogs of plant chemistry. So nicotine, for example, and neonicotinoids are pyrethroids, pyrethrum and pyrethroids. So there's always been this sort of products released, problems identified, and then moving towards something safer. And it has never affected crop production over time. All it has done is it has ensured that we have a safer environment. Next slide, please. So here's an example. So these are neonicotinoids in the UK, used as seed treatment. Seed treatment, of course, completely against the principles of integrated pest management, but there you have it. And what you see here is that problems identified with imidacloprid in the early 2000s, and imidacloprid was phased out in the UK, and then clothianidin was brought in, and then that began to be phased out. And if you look at seed treatments now in the UK, it's thimethoxam and other safer pesticides. So what you see is also, you'll see that there's this trajectory in all these cases. More and more pesticide is used, but the more dangerous ones are being successively phased out. Next slide, please. So if you look at this is a study from Nature from the US, and you look at what's happened in 6 of the major crops in the United States, and you see at least in 3 of them, so soybean, rice, and spring wheat, you see that the toxicity of products that's been applied to land in the United States under these crops has declined drastically from what it was in the 1990s. So banning and phasing out and investigating the problems associated with agrochemicals and replacing them with other agrochemicals in most cases, unfortunately, has led to lower toxicity of products. That does not mean that the environment is less toxic now than it was before, because what has been happening, as well as you've seen in those 2 graphs that I showed you before, the use of pesticides has been increasing. So there's more pesticide used, and actually toxicity, the environmental toxicity is actually higher on average than it was, say, 20 years ago. Again, next slide, please. I was going to leave this out. I'm glad I didn't now, because we have people from Woolworths and other private sector businesses. People are tending to move away now from IPM. I think IPM, as I say, it's academically interesting, and it is practical, but it's seldom used in reality. And they're moving over to integrated crop management. And integrated crop management is really driven by consumers, where consumers say, look, we really want a better future for ourselves and for our kids or whatever, and we are going to engage with farmers to change their pest management practices. Next slide, please. So you have the development of a number of different multi-stakeholder platforms, like the Sustainable Agriculture Initiative, which is based in Switzerland, where farmers and pesticide companies and consumers and big industry, supermarkets and whatever, come together, and they look for ways to basically battle it out and find more sustainable and healthier solutions to food production. SAI covers a number of different crops. Next slide, please. And then this is just an example of a more localized one. It's the Canadian Grain sustainability center, I think it is. But these are people involved in grain production doing the same thing. And the next slide, please. And here you have one on rice. Okay, next slide, please. So I want to very quickly, before we get into the next question, discuss this thing about global pest pressures. And what you'll see in the literature, and I see it all the time, for example, in conferences and things, this alarmism where people say, oh, the climate is changing, temperatures are getting higher. And with increasing temperatures, you do get more rapid development of insects. They're ectothermic, so their development is accelerated under high temperatures. And so you might get more generations in a year. And so, some advocates of pesticides would say, oh, well, look, we're going to have a higher pressure in the future because of climate change. But most of that work has been done in climate chambers, where you just have the insect and you look at the physiology of the insect and nothing else. And in the environment, you have a whole series of natural enemies who are working to control pests. And we have what's called positive feedback mechanisms. So the pest population increases, natural enemy population increases. And remember, most of these natural enemies are spiders and insects and parasitoid wasps, for example, that also increase volcanism with increasing temperatures. And there are studies to show that many of them actually increase faster than many of the herbivores in terms of how many generations they might have under increasing temperatures. So we have a system now, if you are good on agroecology, if you keep a healthy environment and you promote natural enemies, you will maintain this negative feedback mechanism, and you'll be able to kind of counter any potential problems that might arise because of increasing temperatures. And next slide, please. But we did see the case of the plant hoppers, for example, where you had devastating outbreaks of plant hoppers, and those devastating outbreaks were caused by pesticides, where the pesticides had, apart from a number of other things, the main thing was that they had depleted natural enemy abundance in the rice fields. So what does this mean? This means that actually that pesticides, together with increasing temperatures, are likely to destabilize pest pressure in the future and actually increase pest pressure. So it's not the temperatures on their own, it's temperature without natural enemies, which is predominantly caused by poor agroecology and an overuse of pesticides. And I think that's an important point to remember. And I think now you can move to the next question.
Great, thank you so much for that. Okay, so we are going to move on to our next question, which is question 2. It is posted on the screen, and Tatum will also post it in the chat. So the question reads, the term pesticide includes insecticides, herbicides, rodenticides, molluscicides, and others. To propose a global ban on HHPs, do we require alternatives for all these biocide types? If yes, how can we ensure that alternatives exist for all HHPs? If no, how can we convince countries to endorse a global ban without specific identified alternatives? So please post your responses in the chat, engage with each other's responses, and engage with our presenter. If you have any questions for him as well, you can post them in the chat, and we'll be posting some polls as well throughout this question, so keep an eye out for those. Okay, as you can see, we've posted our first poll. So if you would like to respond, you can follow the same procedure. Go to menti.com and use the code on the screen, or you can click on the link that's been posted in the chat. We've got quite a few minutes left to discuss this question. For anyone who's maybe just joined us, we are in the chat room discussing question 2 of this discussion. So please feel free to go ahead and add your contributions to the chat.
So I see that there seems to be a kind of a mix of answers there. Some people say no, let's just get rid of HHPs on the basis of their health-related consequences and consequences for the environment. No need to have one-for-one alternatives. And others saying yes, we should have alternatives basically for every HHP. There is also an interesting comment there from Guyana. Colleague mentioning there that flooding has carried weeds and insects weeds and pests to crops. I have a feeling that, and maybe you can clarify, you're talking about apple snails in rice. And this is a very interesting case actually, because apple snails are controlled largely by molluscicides, some very toxic molluscicides. And one of the main problems is the way that rice is produced in South America, which is where it's not transplanted, but it's direct seeded and wet direct seeded, meaning that the rice plant is very, very tiny when it's flooded, when the fields are flooded, and snails then of course can devour these plants very quickly. and you don't have the same problem in places where rice is transplanted, because the rice is much larger and the snails can't attack it. So here's a case where preventative actions can entirely eliminate the need for a chemical.
I see we have quite a few poll responses, and I think we're shortly going to move on to the next poll. So, Finbarden, if you'd like to address anything in this poll before we move on.
So there's a lot of very interesting answers there. One of the things that a few people are mentioning there is that apart from volcanism when in climate change, so the increase in generations per crop of pest insects, you also get other changes. So changing distributions, for example, insects moving to areas that are now warmer, or decreasing in areas where temperatures are very high. And we do see this as well, where some insect pests are reducing their distribution, or going, having overwintering sites that are now further north than they used to be. And one of the things I would say here is that a lot of the research on climate change and the effects of climate change on insects in particular has to do with butterflies and moths and things that are not pests. And one of the big barriers for the redistribution of pests globally is the availability of food, particularly herbivores, food plants that they can consume in the new range. And this is something that doesn't actually happen with pests very often, because most of the crops, the key crops, the big crops, rice and corn and whatever, are so widespread that any insect can move to any area and they'll find those crops there already. And also the distribution of crops has been changing. So as I said before, it still holds that if you maintain the positive feedback loops in these cases, you will reduce the possibilities of severe outbreaks or severe damage from pests. Okay, so Ahmed there has a very interesting observation. He's saying we are seeing a sharp decline in insect populations in many insect orders. This is correct, and this has been documented globally. So many of the beneficial insects are actually in decline, and many of these are natural enemies of pests. There are many reasons for that. Pesticide is one. Climate change is unlikely to be a problem for most insects, except in high mountains. And the way to rectify that, I mean, these insects haven't disappeared, they've just declined in abundance, is to promote agroecology and promote an environment that sustains these animals. And so you'll see, for example, in Europe, particularly, where now it's very common that people will grow gardens with wildflowers for bees. You're getting a return of bee populations in many European countries, but flowers are also a source of nectar for the adult stages of many predatory insects. So that's also likely to have a very good effect on agriculture, promoting pollinators and natural enemies through agroecology.
Okay, we have posted our next poll, so please could you respond to the poll? And as mentioned, you can either go to menti.com and use the code on the screen, or post your responses using the link posted in the chat. I think we have a few more minutes left to discuss this question, so perhaps send your final responses and we will wrap it up in another 5 minutes.
So there is a comment there, I don't see the name, saying that Europe, oops, lost it. Smith Giacodi says Europe, the European Union producers are playing in China with HHPs, and that's correct. I mean, the reality is that, and it's not about being European or being Chinese. It's about putting profits before people in many cases. There are a number, for example, of companies in lower and middle income countries like Indonesia, in India, in Pakistan, that are also producing HHPs. In fact, many HHPs are predominantly produced locally because they're generic in many countries. Europe is the #1 exporter of chemical products in terms of value, but exports certainly increased with the increased production of active ingredients in China. So it really is a market that's sort of feeding itself, active ingredient and raw materials going from one part of the world to another and then moving on. So I think it's always good not to, not to think in terms of, a nation and the role a nation plays. Hopefully legislation would prevent exports of banned products from Europe in the future, if they're not already there. But many chemicals are locally produced, and it is really a case of you can make a lot of money from HHPs.
Okay, great. I think we can start to wrap up this question. So Finbar, if you have any final comments on the poll, the chat, and then we can move on to question 3.
Okay, so what I thank you for your comments, and what I do see there is that so when I started this talk, I did try and give a landscape of plant protection, and I divided it into 2 parts. One was the preventative measures, and the other was curative measures. And what we're actually seeing, and that's on the basis of IPM practice, and what we're actually seeing now is that many chemical companies, for example, and extension officers included, from government sectors in some countries, are proposing calendar-based applications of pesticides. And this is actually a preventative use of pesticides, which is illegal in terms of integrated pest management. So I think when we discuss here and alternatives, the question was, do we need alternatives for everything? We must remember that we are looking for alternatives to HHPs, and that HHPs, if they're used in the way that they were designed, they are curative after consideration through the IPM framework. And so they should only be used, or like any pesticide or any biopesticide, as a last resort. And I think I cannot emphasize that enough, that we cannot escape from that reality. Alternatives, when you talk about alternatives in terms of agroecology, or when you talk about crop management related alternatives, these are not really alternatives to what HHPs are supposed to be used for. And so the alternatives tend to be, they must be things that are usable when pests and diseases are starting to get out of control. Okay, and I just clarify that, but I think most people feel that alternatives are already available, and I think they are. Certainly, if you move from HHPs to a safer pesticide, that's the first step. We don't want that really. We want to engage people in IPM and agroecology, but you know, in terms of arguments that you remove a product that's essential to agriculture, there are alternatives, chemical alternatives, pretty much for every HHP out there. Yeah, thank you, Maxine.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so I think we can move on to our final question for today. So Finbar, over to you.
So the final question, and there was a comment earlier on that I didn't get to from Ellie about evidence, and so this may answer that question a little bit. So what I want to do here is, because this question will relate to evidence and requirements for moving forward. But first, I want to present this kind of this part in two ways. So I'm going to first look at the reality on the ground. So a lot of the debate around maintaining HHPs is that we can manage the risks, we can reduce exposures, we can use protective equipment to keep the pesticides off our skin or out of our lungs or out of our eyes or whatever. But the reality is, you know, I've worked for, I don't want to say how long, but I've worked for many years in the tropics, in agriculture, and I have never seen a pesticide applicator in my life in the tropics where protective equipment. This is the standard here in this photograph, and this is better than what you generally see. Here there's an applicator wearing a t-shirt over his cap, and you know, pulled up around his nose. Completely inadequate protection if the chemical is a highly hazardous pesticide. So the question is, can we reduce the risk to exposure? Well, it's not a reality at the moment, and it doesn't seem like it's going to be a reality into the future. And it's certainly not going to be policed. Many applicators in many parts of the world are from very, very poor backgrounds. They are not the farmers. They do not own the land. They're just day laborers. They're very poor. They cannot afford protective equipment. And often, unfortunately, they don't have the education around the hazards from the pesticides they're applying. Next slide, please. So here's an interesting image, and this is from the United States. So this is a farmer who was applying pesticide with protective equipment inside the cabin of a tractor. Okay, and so in this study, and there's a number of studies like this, they put fluorescent dye in the pesticide, and then after the application has been done, they take the applicator and they photograph him with the UV light to see where is the pesticide residue. And in this image, I think probably Tatum, if you could expand the image a little bit, it's a kind of a ghostly image of the face. But what you see there is you see this chemical over the nose, and importantly, you see that he's been wearing a mask, and the mask has some ventilation holes, which are probably protected on the inside with some sort of a mesh or gauze or something, and yet the pesticide has got through to his face around the mouth. So protective equipment not giving any real, well, giving some protection, but it's not total protection. Next slide. Okay. So here again, you see the back of the farmer, you know, where he's wiped his hand on his neck or whatever, wearing protective equipment, and then you see pesticide accumulate on his back. So the idea that you can reduce exposure to highly hazardous pesticides, carcinogenic substances associated with neurological disorders, reproductive health issues, etc., is really stretching it a little bit. Okay, next slide, please. So again, getting back to Ellie's question there and about what evidence is required, the whole issue around banning pesticides is what we would call a wicked problem in that you have two opposing sides, and whatever evidence you present is never going to be enough. Perhaps more on the side that has vested interest than the other, but certainly both sides will always question the evidence. And I just want to give an example of a study from Sri Lanka and tea plantations. So next slide. So this was an analysis of 22 different studies on soil erosion on tea plantations, from tea plantations in Sri Lanka, and they looked at the 22 studies, they looked at the methodology, and they looked at the estimates of soil erosion. And the main finding was that the difference between the highest and the lowest estimates of erosion in the same catchment area was 8,000-fold. So the highest was a development agency for the third world that gave a rate of over 1,000 tons per hectare per year. And the lowest was the Tea Research Institute that gave a rate of less than 0.13 tons per hectare per year. So it's not surprising that the research institute that's advocating tea plantations, etc., has the lowest estimate, and an agency for development has the highest estimate. And we see this all the time. And actually, we're looking into this in terms of looking at efficacy studies on pesticides. Next study, please. Or next slide. Thank you. So this study, and it's quite an old study now, Priscoli, but it still goes on. We see it all the time, saying, look, these, the studies all had good design, all had good application of statistics. They were all well written, whatever. It's just that their opinions differed, and so they had a bias already going into the study. Next slide, please. Actually, we can skip this. I meant to take this out. Next one, please. So here's another interesting case. This is a bias, and this is what we call confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is rife in literature around the need for pesticides or the problems caused by insects. And this is basically where research has found something, and then subsequent research returns to find the same thing again and again. And to break away from that cycle is very, very difficult. So here you see, for example, Theophilus Painter, who was an American, first looked at the human genome in terms of counting chromosomes, and he counted 24 chromosomes and published the paper. And then this was repeatedly observed for 30 years. So study after study did the same thing, found 24 chromosomes. And then in 1955, Johin Tijo, who I think is a Thai researcher, couldn't find 24. He could only find 23. And so he published that. And he was correct. There's actually only 23 chromosomes in the human genome. So what you have there, this is a clear case of confirmation bias. Somebody's published something and we continue to find it again and again. This is a very strong example because it should be so simple to count chromosomes. Next slide, please. But we do see it in, for example, when people are looking at the global burden of pests and weeds and diseases. There are a number of studies out there that have tried to quantify what kind of damage is caused to crops from pests and diseases. And every one of them is either, very unlikely, because you're talking about pests causing 90 to 100% damage in many cases, which is obviously a problem with bad management wherever that study was conducted. Or you have a case like this, which was published in Nature, where certain records are taken out of the analysis because they're giving very low estimates. So you see here, for example, in this study, they're saying rice, which is a crop I worked on many years, globally, there's about 30% losses from pathogens and pests. I would say that that's very, very unlikely. And so what you are seeing is that you're seeing the literature on pests, diseases, and weeds, and the literature on efficacy of pesticides is very biased in favor of we have a problem with pests, and the solution is pesticides. And next slide, please. We saw that in the debates around GM, where actually it's almost impossible to even discuss GMs now as a scientist or your career could end very swiftly. And this is an interesting editor's note from Nature, where the editor said, the Mexican maize GM controversy illustrates how in this field, the quest for scientific truth is conducted in a minefield of opinion and accusations of vested interest. And I think it's interesting that he put in the word accusations of vested interest there instead of just vested interests. And this had to do with the withdrawal of a paper that had been published on the consequences of GM maize for Mexico. Next slide, please. Okay, so that just leads into the next question about evidence is required. I hand you back to Maxine.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so this is our final question for today. And as you can see on the screen, it says the debate around HHPs is centered on eliminating risk to human health, mainly, and the environment, while at the same time increasing global food and livelihood securities. Proponents of a global ban suggest this is achievable. Opponents suggest that it is not achievable. What evidence is required to support these opposing arguments? So this question has also been posted in the chat, and so we encourage you to please post your contributions in the chat, and we will also be posting some polls. Thank you so much. Okay, we are posting our first poll, so please feel free to vote using menti.com and the code on the screen, or the link that is posted in the chat, and let us know what you think about this poll.
Okay, I think I want to thank Olga Speranskaya for clarifying something that I think is important in terms of the European Union. And Olga has indicated that the European Union disallows the production for export of banned chemicals, banned pesticides. So the pesticides, certainly HHPs, that turn up in developing countries have not come from the European Union, and I think this is actually probably the same for many other developed countries, of course. So thank you, Olga, for that clarification.
We are going to shortly post a second poll, so if you haven't voted on this poll yet, please do so. And Finbar, if you'd like to make any comments, then you can go for it.
Okay. Just on this poll, this is about the question between trade-offs. Will there be trade-offs? And the trade-offs are between eliminating health risks and environmental risks from pesticides and ensuring food security. I'm actually a little bit surprised that most people have said yes. My personal understanding would be no. There are a number of studies that that have been done related to suicide, and actually with colleagues from my own center, the Center for Pesticide Suicide Prevention, for example, where pesticides have been banned, highly hazardous pesticides have been banned in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, in Taiwan, and in Korea. And it has had no effect on food production, but has had massive improvements for the quality of life of people living in the countryside. So, of course, these are all opinions, even though there's data to support everyone's opinion, I guess. But I would have put my my bet on no, that there will not be trade-offs between A and B.
Great. We have posted our final Mentimeter poll for the day. So please respond to this poll using the code on the screen if you go to menti.com, or the link posted in the chat. Tatum has let us know that there's 5 minutes left to discuss this question as well. So please post your final responses in the chat and then also respond to our poll. Thank you so much.
Okay, as people are doing this poll, I see a number of comments, particularly pointed comments at the European Union. Again, what I would say is that in terms of HHPs on the ground in developing countries, the vast majority of HHPs are generic products that are produced by local companies. And so the European Union is working, and I don't represent the European Union. I just want to maybe orient your ire, orient your focus on making change. If you're focused on trying to make change by, promoting change in the European Union, when the problem is a local problem in your own country, then you're misdirecting your focus. So I would say be very careful to consider where the highly hazardous pesticides are coming from in your own country. And I would say in most cases, they are locally produced because they're generic products in most cases. So there are 5 minutes. I think there's a little bit of time left here. And for this poll, you could answer, several. You could have, for example, 1, 2, and option A, B, and C. Of course, D is exclusive of A, B, and C. So A, B, and C, you might opt for all those three.
Okay, I think we'll wrap up this discussion shortly.
Okay.
So, Finbar, if you have any final comments.
Okay, so just on that poll, so a number of people have said no, that trade-offs are not acceptable. So basically saying food production is more important than human health and the environment. This is a standard answer. Many people would see it that way. People tend to think that accidental poisoning is, reducing accidental poisoning is a worthwhile trade-off, but not suicide, interestingly, and not wildlife protection. So this is this is sort of, we're not different. Most people are the same. If we interview farmers and we ask them why have they reduced pesticide use, their main concern is accidental poisoning of themselves or poisoning of the food that they're going to eat themselves. So that's why I think, environment, of course, I'm an ecologist, environment is very important, but focusing on issues around health and the health of people in rural areas is very important.
Okay, great. I think that is our discussion for today. I will start to just wrap us up. So firstly, just to say thank you so much to our presenter, Finbar, from the Center for Pesticide Suicide Prevention. Thank you for your time and your effort that you've put into planning this discussion with us and attending and presenting today. We appreciate your expertise and your time. Thank you to all of the participants for joining, and thanks to Tatum in the background, who has been our supportive and administrative person doing all the background work. We have some evaluation polls that we've posted on the screen in Zoom. So please will you complete those polls? We really value your feedback. If you have not registered for the Pesticide Discussion Forum or signed up for our Pesticide Weekly newsletter, please consider doing so. A link can be posted in the chat, or just contact us and we will let you know how to sign up. We will send around a summary digest of this discussion. So thank you to those who have registered and signed up. You will receive a summary of what was said in this discussion and some key points going forward. The summary digest and the PowerPoints can be accessed through our division website as well. Finally, our next discussion will be on the 17th of October, and the topic will be pesticides and suicides, how to implement policy change. So thank you so much for all coming today. Thank you, Finbar, and we appreciate all of you being here and all your contributions. So yeah, please continue to post on our evaluation poll, and we will see you next time.
Thank you very much, Maxine. Thank you, Tatum, as well, for all your help. Bye-bye.